Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Penn Vicarage. Lovely to see you on this Wednesday morning. I hope you are well and cheerful. I'm counting down the Wednesdays, the reopening of the golf course. But for now, it's going to be a nice walk this morning. Looking forward to a good day. Hope you are too. Just to remind you, if I may, we have our Zoom Alpha course. It started last week, but you can join tomorrow if you want to. Last week was an introductory session. If you want to come along, just let us know. I will send you a Zoom invitation. It starts 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. If you'd like to come, or you know someone that would like to come, then please let us know and we'll send them or you a Zoom invitation. And it will be great. Lovely chat last week. Great people coming, and you'd be welcome to join us as well. Now, we're in John's Gospel and we're in chapter 7. Just to recap the last 2 or 3 days, Jesus has fed he's up north, he's fed 5,000 people, he's walked on the water, he's had a conversation with the people at the synagogue in Capernaum, and now we're in chapter 7, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 13. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He did not wish to go about in Judea, because the Jews were looking for an opportunity to kill him. Now the Jewish festival of booths was near, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For nobody who wants to be widely known acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify against it that its works are evil. Go to the festival yourselves. I'm not going to the festival, for my time has not yet fully come." After this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone to the festival, then he also went, not publicly, but as it were in secret. The Jews were looking for him at the festival and saying, "Where is he?" And there was considerable complaining about him amongst the crowds. Well, some were saying, "He's a good man." Others were saying, "No, he's deceiving the crowd." Yet no one would speak openly about him for fear of the Jews. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, as I said, Jesus fed 5,000 people, walked on the water, and has this conversation with the people at Capernaum. Then he stays up north, and we know he stays up north for about 6 months. Why do we know this? Because, look at the clues. When he fed 5,000 people, there was lots of green grass around. The festival, which means the spring. The festival of booths happened in the autumn. So from spring to the autumn is 6 months. So he stayed up north around Galilee for about 6 months. And it's interesting that actually, because lots of Bible studies like that. Lots of Bible studies about gleaning clues from here, there and everywhere and putting it all together like a big jigsaw puzzle. And it kind of reminds me, like I always say, that when you're doing Bible study, always look at the small print. Always look at the little details, the when it happened, the who was there, the small details, the when, the why, the who, and all sorts of. Look at the small print, you might say, and the whole thing comes together nicely. So Jesus has stayed up north for about 6 months before the Festival of Booths. Now, Festival of Booths actually is I think it's a rather really good idea. The people of Israel had spent 40 years between leaving Egypt and slavery under Moses. They spent 40 years in the wilderness, living hand to mouth, depending completely on God before they went into the promised land. And while they're in the wilderness, they lived in tents, and they lived, as I say, hand to mouth, depending on God constantly and completely, because as I say, they lived in tents. And so what the people of God used to do in the Festival of Booths is they used to consciously live in tents for a week. They'd come out of their brick buildings or whatever, their stone buildings, and they used to live in tents. And in the countryside, they put up a tent outside. And in the urban areas, they used to put a tent on top of their flat roof, and they'd live in it for a week. And I think it's great actually, because it kind of reminds them that for those 40 years, they had to depend completely on God. For 40 years, they hadn't got brick buildings and hard solid walls around them, but they had to depend completely on God. And I think it's a really, really good thing, because I think often for us, really, we become very stable. We've become very establishment, you might say. And church has often become a sort of bastion of establishment and stability, and we kind of depend on our lovely buildings and our walls and so on. And I think what the great thing about the Festival of Booths is it reminds us actually that we depend on God, and reminded them that they depend on God. There's a fascinating phrase in the Bible where it talks about the pillars of the earth belong to God. we may think with pillars that we're held up those days, but actually it's God who holds everything together. And I think we need to be reminded, actually, that we depend on God. That God didn't just make us, but God sustains us and holds us as well. And that even though we have lots of material well-being these days, actually that we do ultimately depend on God. It's God who looks after us. And I think the Festival of Booths is great because it reminded them that for those 40 years, they depended completely on God, his provision, his guidance, his supply, his presence. And actually today, we also depend on God for his guidance, his love, his presence, and so on. So I quite like the Festival of Blues. I think it's sort of good. Maybe we should do an equivalent. Maybe we should sort of, I don't know, whatever it will be, some sort of equivalent. But that's the Festival of Booths. But Jesus, back to Jesus again, he's been up north for about 6 months, and he's been keeping his head down. He knows that in Jerusalem, they've not forgiven him at all, for healing that lame man on the Sabbath in chapter 5, and he knows that they're out to kill him. But he's talking to his brothers. Now, interesting here, his brothers are not his disciples. His brothers are literally his flesh and blood brothers. They are the sons of Mary. We're talking about his family. And what I think is interesting here is that even his own brothers don't believe in him. He's just you get the impression his disciples have waned a bit, but also even his own brothers don't believe in him. So if you have unbelieving members of your family, then take comfort. Even Jesus had unbelieving siblings too. And I think there's a degree, I think some of us could take a degree of comfort in that. But these brothers tell him, look, Jesus, you're a miracle worker. Your popularity is down in the polls, you might say. Even your disciples are struggling a bit. And a man like you, don't keep it quiet. Show off yourself, and the Festival of Booths is coming. Anyone's going to be in Jerusalem. Go there. Show people what you can do. Wonderful opportunity. You can encourage your disciples, remind them what a great guy you are, and show the disciples and show the crowds what a fantastic miracle worker you are. And Jesus says to them, it's quite interesting. He says, "You go, but my time has not yet come." And I think it's interesting, actually. Two things briefly about this is that firstly that Jesus does not work on expediency. Jesus worked according to God's calendar. Jesus was going to do things in God's time. He wasn't going to be persuaded by what would look good for the here and now. He was actually going to do things in God's time. He did go, but he did go a few days later. He didn't go when they told him to. He didn't go when it seemed convenient or whatever, or expedient. But he went up in God's time. And I think we need to be constantly reminded that Jesus actually did God's will, and he acted according to God's will in God's plan, not the plan of expediency or what seemed like a good idea at the time. Jesus was going to work according to God's plan, and I suppose that also reminds us of us really in our prayers. And sometimes when we pray, as it says, sometimes God says yes, and sometimes God says no. But actually, sometimes God says not yet. And I can think of several times in my life when I prayed for something and the answer has not come then because the time hasn't been right. And I think we need to remember that we also need to, like Jesus, try and work according to God's timing. And remember, as I say, that sometimes when we pray, sometimes God says yes, of course. And sometimes God says no. But also, God sometimes says not yet. But in my experience, in retrospect, I found God's timing to be perfect. So, my friends, 3 things from this morning's reading. Firstly, when you look at the Bible, always look at the small print, the fine details, and work out from that and put it all together. And it all comes into a fantastic picture. That's why we know that Jesus spent 6 months up north. Second thing to say, I love the Festival of Booths. I think it's great to be reminded. And I wish we could somehow do something in church, something to kind of remind ourselves, obviously, that we depend completely on God. That whilst we often get a bit too dependent on our buildings and our finances and so on, actually, on our reserves and stuff, we need to remember that we actually depend on God. Every breath we take depends on God. And finally, also, to remember that Jesus works according to God's time rather than human time. And actually let's allow God to sometimes say yes to us, sometimes say no to us, but also sometimes not yet. And to try and attune ourselves to God's timing rather than what seems like our timing sometimes. Hope that makes sense.